Hello everyone! Today we take a step back to the 70s and the Heath government and talk about union strikes. Or at least I wish we were, because then in less than a decade we'd have another Margaret Thatcher. Unfortunately, we are currently experiencing a incompetent government. Rail strikes. Passengers face disruption as Britain's biggest walkout in decades begin. Network Rail and train operator staff walk out on Tuesday, beginning what is expected to be almost a week of cancellations and delays. Thanks, train staff. Train passengers were facing widespread disruption and cancellations as Britain's biggest nationwide rail strike for 30 years began on Tuesday morning. Workers responsible for train lines and infrastructure across the UK walked out on Tuesday, with further action on Thursday and Saturday, leaving thousands of services cancelled and passengers forced to seek alternative means of transport. Only about 4,500 of the usual 20,000 daily services were expected to run due to the walkout by 40,000 Rail, Maritime and Transport Union members at Network Rail, the organisation that maintains the system, and 13 train operators. So the rail network in the UK is currently working at less than 25% capacity, all in the name of higher pay and better conditions for the workers of railway networks, which is similar to what the unions were trying to strike for, especially the miners' union, back in the 70s against the Ted Heath government. He made a bunch of concessions to them, and in doing so basically brought Britain to its knees. And then we had a Labour government that kept on bowing to the unions, and then, would you know it, democracy works for once, and Margaret Thatcher comes in and basically tells them all to do one, allowing Britain's economy to work properly and have one of the highest rates of growth post-war. Unfortunately, it's not just the railway network that is taking its toll. The London Underground workers will also strike for 24 hours on Tuesday, bringing the capital's transport system to a halt. Last-ditch talk on Monday failed to resolve the bitter dispute over pay, jobs and conditions, with all sides blaming each other for the lack of progress. The RMT General Secretary, Mike Lynch, said the rail dispute could not be resolved without the government removing the shackles on Network Rail and train operating companies. All parts of the rail industry, as well as Transport for London, have been told to find savings, with fare revenue falling away since COVID. He told the BBC's Newsnight on Monday that Network Rail had offered a 2% pay rise, with the possibility of a further 1%, later dependent on efficiency savings. So just at face value, that seems like something I'd want, the government removing shackles and regulation from a particular, well, just from everything to do with the economy. But when it comes to this union, they do have political power, and they do rely on Labour to be a good socialist opposition to actually have any power, because the thing is, if the Tories don't kowtow to them, then the unions will say you all have to vote for Labour so that we can get what we want, essentially. And obviously voting in this country is a secret ballot, so there's no way that the union can actually fire people for not voting Labour, but it will be pushed massively and give them a bit of an edge. And even then, they don't really want the shackles removed. What they want is basically just a pay rise and to get everything they want, which is what they were getting in the 70s, so at least we're not at that point yet. But it would be good for the Tories to find a way to undercut these strikes, whether it be training reserve staff for when these types of things happen, or maybe even look into automating the rail network. Preferably through private entrepreneurship, of course, but this is the United Kingdom's government. We barely do anything that relies on the actual private sector. And no, I do not count outsourcing as the private sector, because the government will outsource endless money to private companies that do contracts for them. When they screw up, they are not allowed to fail. That is not capitalism. Anyway, Network Rail has escalated the disputes during Monday's talks, saying that they have issued me a letter saying that they are going to be redundancy starting from July 1st. So rather than trying to come to an agreement in this dispute, they've escalated it by giving us formal notice of redundancy amongst our Network Rail members. Which is of course just going to annoy the unions, but if you reduce the power the unions have, it's not really going to be a problem in the end. He warned the dispute could continue for months, adding it is clear that the Tory government, after slashing £4 billion of funding from National Rail and Transport for London, has now actively prevented a settlement to this dispute. The rail companies have now proposed pay rates that are massively under the relevant rates of inflation, coming on top of the pay freezes of the past few years. At the behest of the government, companies are also seeking to implement thousands of job cuts and have failed to give any guarantee against compulsory redundancies. And this is another issue with the way that the railways work in the United Kingdom, because everyone seems to think they're privatised, and that's not quite true. They're not a fully privatised industry. So just a brief summary of the railway network in the United Kingdom. The UK railway network was first developed by private companies during the Great Construction era of Victorian Britain. So if anyone ever asks you libertarians out there who's going to build the roads, you can literally just say, well, who built the railways in Britain? By 1948, though, they had been nationalised as British Rail, due to the wartime era of nationalising everything, an amorphous bureaucratic organisation that attracted much criticism from passengers, whose requirements seem to have been accorded little priority. In the mid-90s, British Rail was controversially split up by John Major. The rail network was transferred to Railtrack, while the customer-facing passenger transport element was subjected to franchising system, whereby bidders would apply to become the train operating company TOC for a specified region. Freight was handled separately, while management of rolling stock was allocated to the three rolling stock companies, or ROSCOs. And this is the era that people still think we're in. That we have a franchising system for the rail network when it comes to the train operating companies, and it is a free marketeer's dream. Well, the railway franchising system was chosen partly at the instigation of the Treasury to drive competition via open access to the network. Vertical integration as a policy was discarded, apart from the Isle of Wight. Hence, the concept of regional railway system, which had been the model pre-World War II, was not reintroduced, a major error. Instead, the railway franchise system arguably had its roots in the controversial TV franchising auction in '91, where the right to broadcast in the valuable Midlands region was won by the sole bid from the Central Independent Television for a derisory sum. The first franchise put out to tender was won by Stagecoach, which, despite its colourful history, had proposed on the back of the privatisation of the bus sector during the 80s. On 4 February 1996, the 5:10am train to London Waterloo duly left Twickenham station, thereby becoming the first passenger train service to be operated under a private franchise since 1948, when the network had been nationalised. Subsequently, in 1996, the initial public offering of Railtrack, the owner of the nationwide rail network, and many related property assets took place. Despite a massive backlog of maintenance, it flourished initially before failing in 2001, when it was renationalised virtually overnight. And this seems to coincide with government subsidies for the railway network. As we can see, it was fairly consistent between 4 and 1 billion between the 80s and 1995, and obviously in 1995 it dropped like a stone because a load of private investment came into the railway networks. Obviously, going forward towards 2000, more subsidies had to be put in place for the reason I'm not sure, but for something to be truly free market, there has to be absolutely zero subsidies whatsoever, and also zero tax, but neither of those things are particularly realistic. But you can certainly say that railway privatisation did happen between, apparently, the years of 1996 and 2001. That's only 5 years. That's hardly a good enough time to actually get privatisation working properly. And even considering all this, the Institute of Economic Affairs actually did a study on railway privatisation and found it to be generally a good thing. The summary of their findings states, the number of passengers in kilometres had grown rapidly since privatisation, train punctuality improved considerably after privatisation, improvements only came to a halt as a result of government meddling after the Hatfield incident, which is also part of the reason that it failed. The government then just put a load of regulation into the railway system, including putting much lower speed limits than you would need in certain areas, in most areas in fact, and added way more health and safety regulations than was necessary, to the point where, as stated in the previous article, in 2001 it failed under all this new regulation, and so it was basically just renationalised. But safety also improved faster after privatisation than before privatisation for all classes of accidents. It's just with the Hatfield incident, there was a bit of an issue with health and safety maintenance checks on the rails, which caused derailment and 4 people to die with 70 being injured, which is obviously a massive tragedy. However, after the inevitable trial and the costs to the company for this, it should either be sold off to someone who can maintain it better, or the train company would keep the contract and obviously massively improve health and safety, with no necessary need for government. But this is the United Kingdom post-war. They want the government in absolutely everything. In 2003, the rate of broken rails per million train kilometres was the lowest for 40 years, though yes, this was after renationalisation overnight in 2001. This is also because of the maintenance work put in by private capital. Speaking of which, capital spending increased by £4.6 billion between 1990 and 2002, partly to make up for decades of underinvestment before privatisation. With the trade-offs, it seems clear that privatisation is an improvement. But now we have Network Rail, which is the public body that basically oversees every railway network. It is ridiculous to think we currently have a privatised system. It is not true. And if you want absolute proof of that, the Department for Transport disputed Mr Lynch's claim, adding that it has cost taxpayers about £600, I assume that is, per household to keep the railway running during the coronavirus pandemic. It is entirely nationalised. It is through national subsidies at £600 per household, I might add, to keep the railway system even going, to keep people in these jobs, to allow them to have a furlough scheme. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, said talks remained a matter for the employers. He said that the strikes were being orchestrated by some of the best paid union barons representing some of the better paid workers in this country, which will cause misery and chaos to millions of commuters. And that's not even a joke, by the way. It makes me tear up how much these union bosses are making. According to the Daily Mail, the three fat cat union barons holding London to ransom, the RMT bosses raking in £328,000 in salaries and benefits, including a subsidised car. And that doesn't stand for anything, that literally just mean a motor car. The Daily Mail like to capitalise these things to get people's attention. Rail union bosses who today brought London Tube's station network to a standstill rake in a combined £327,427 in salary and benefits a year, including a car. And this was back in March when there was a strike for London's tube network. And I can't imagine that their money and income has gone down since. Around 10,000 members of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union today walked out for 24 hours and will do it again on Thursday in a row over jobs, pensions and conditions, the exact same reason they're doing it now. But their bosses are unlikely to feel the pinch of having to shell out on expensive taxis felt by some Londoners today, thanks to the high pay and an RMT subsidised car. Most recent annual return for the trade union details the whopping wage slips and benefits received by the top three officers. General Secretary Mike Litch, who once sighed, "All I want from life is a bit of socialism," collects a package worth some £124,888. How's that socialism doing for you, my dude? His senior assistant, General Secretary Steve Headley, is on a £62,664 gross salary, with employers' national insurance contributions of £7,823,000 and pension contributions of £21,793 and a car benefit of £1,712, giving him a £93,992 bundle. I would kill for that. And of the final three is Eddie Dempsey, the RMT's Assistant General Secretary. Dempsey gets no car but is on a package worth £108,000. And for an added laugh, here is RMT Assistant General Secretary Steve Headley LARPing as a Russian revolutionary with some stolen German assault rifle, namely the STG-44. So to anyone out there who says that people grow out of their socialist revolutionary time when they get older and own a house and things like this, yeah, this isn't true. People will naturally be left-wing and socialist, because it's actually quite similar to what our evolutionary mindset needed to be in the early days of the caveman, whereby you had a better chance of surviving if you stuck together as a pack and helped those in need. That's why even right-wingers give to charity, and in fact give more to charity. And it's also a reason that generally you will see people being converts from the left a lot more than you'll see people being converts to the left from the right. Because I hate to say it, but the right wing seems to have more facts on their side. So it appears that the government has been in talks with the rail union for some time, and now they're just going to strike. And at the end of this article it says Boris Johnson was expected to say ahead of a cabinet meeting today on Tuesday, that unions were harming the very people they claim to be helping. He is set to accuse unions of driving away commuters who ultimately support the jobs of rail workers while also hitting businesses across the country. So at this point I'm not exactly sure what the government are going to do about this. They might end up with public support to either pass or repeal certain acts that make it easier to attack the union on certain grounds. I just know that the absolute last thing that they should do is give them any ground, because it's the classic leftist thing: if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. And with this being the biggest, or one of the biggest unions in the United Kingdom, if they get anywhere, with any of these strikes, then what are the small unions going to do? They're going to do the exact same thing until they get what they want. And this is exactly what kept happening to Ted Heath in the 70s. Through Ted Heath we got the 3-day week by kowtowing to the NUM, or the National Union of Miners. Rolling blackouts, people couldn't work, the economy essentially ground to a halt, and Labour came in, didn't improve anything, and then we get Thatcher. So at least if they do that, we might get an Iron Lady type Prime Minister in a decade. But I'd rather just not have the bad thing in the first place. Though I will end this story on something funny, because Keir Starmer once again can't get control of his party. Keir Starmer tells Labour front bench they should not join rail strike pickets. Unions critical of the leader's instruction to senior MPs to show leadership by not publicly siding with the workers. Labour's front benchers have been warned to stay away from the picket lines on the eve of the biggest rail strike since '89. As staff get ready to take part in the RMT strike on Tuesday, Keir Starmer's office told shadow cabinet members to show leadership, front benchers should not be on the picket line. The order from the leader's office said, "We have robust lines. We do not want to see these strikes to go ahead with the resulting disruption to the public. The government has failed to engage in any negotiations," which isn't true. "However, we must also show leadership, and to that end, please be reminded that front benchers, including parliamentary private secretaries, should not be on the picket lines. Please speak to all members of your team to remind them so this, and confirm it with me that you have done so." So you might want to get the Curb Your Enthusiasm music out, because guess what happened? Well, firstly, Navendu Mishra, the Labour Member of Parliament for Stockport, and in the front bench of Parliament as one of the Labour whips, so this is probably one of the most important people you don't want going to the picket lines and defying the leader. He sent out a tweet saying this treacherous government has underfunded and mismanaged our public transport network for more than a decade. As a proud trade unionist, I stand with all workers on our railway network who are taking industrial action to fight for their jobs and keeping passengers safe, with a little picture there of him at the picket line. Next we have Paula Barker, who is also on the front bench as a private secretary in the shadow cabinet. She tweeted out, "My team visited the RMT union picket at the network rail maintenance site in my constituency this afternoon. These are the workers that maintain the tracks and overhead lines to keep us all safe, although obviously they're not working on them today." And there's a picture of all the lovely workers. And yet another front bencher who has decided to ignore Keir Starmer's request. Third to defy Keir Starmer is Kate Osborne, yet another front bench private secretary to the shadow cabinet. On the picket line at Bromley, "I'm a trade unionist. I will always stand on the side of the workers. Solidarity. Hashtag tube strike. Hashtag rail strike." There's a picture of her with some of the workers who joined the union and the picket line. And finally, we have the leader of Scottish Labour, and though not an MP, is an MSP, Member of Scottish Parliament, and should probably still be heeding the Labour leader's words. So he tweeted out, "Solidarity with those on the picket lines. This is a crisis entirely of the government's making. The workers don't want strikes, the unions don't want strikes, the public don't want strikes. They demand better," with 3 pictures of him meeting the different union members. And I think it's worth pointing out at this point that these protests and picket lines are entirely organised. People who work for the railway lines, they will essentially be forced to strike and also forced to go to the picket lines at certain times. They even have rotas for it. And if they don't do that, then they will be fired, because the unions have that much power over your job. Which again is much like how it was in the 70s, though they had way more power back then. You actually had to join a union when you, say, became a miner, and if you didn't join the union or refused to join the union, then you said goodbye to your job. It's not quite that bad now, but if you do join the union, you do have to do as they say or risk your job. At least as far as I'm aware, and most people will want to join the union because unions do their jobs in so far as they do try and push for better conditions and pay for their workers. However, everyone ends up hating them because they do things for their workers at the behest of absolutely everyone outside the industry. How do you get higher working conditions and higher pay? Oh, it has to come out of either the taxpayer or out of the people actually using the railway networks and paying for the privilege. So I don't really hate the people on the union picket lines. I obviously don't like the organisers at all, but a lot of people there are basically being forced to be there. I think they'd rather be striking by just sitting at home and doing nothing and getting paid for the pleasure. That's what I'd want to do. But I don't think I'm going to get many updates on this until after Saturday, when they have their final day of striking. Either Johnson will give them some concessions and then they will push for a lot more, or he'll go a bit more to the Maggie Thatcher side and basically try and work his way around the unions to get the rails running on time again. Privatising them probably isn't the worst way to go, Boris, I'm just saying. Because if you're going to end up nationalising them, then you'll have the issues you had in post-World War II trains, where everything was dilapidated, the train carriages were terrible, they barely ran on time, and then as soon as you get privatisation in, according to the IEA's report at least, everything starts to improve until the government needs to get its hands in it again. But everyone thinks we're under a state of privatisation, and it's completely wrong. If there's one thing you take away from this video, it's that the railway system in the United Kingdom is not a private market, since it is completely overseen by a public body, all to the expense of the taxpayer. The railway systems are completely subsidised by everyone else, and not just funded by the people that actually use them, which is how a privatised system would work. Anyway, all we can do is wait and see to see how these strikes end up and what results come of them. Hopefully it will be a cause for celebration, but those are few and far between with Boris Johnson in charge. That's everything I had for you today, so as usual, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.